I've always been a firm believer that to understand the future, it's often helpful to have some historical context. Can you give us a distillation?
Yes, that will be a pleasure. History is something of a passion of mine, even though I'm a scientist by background. But as people currently understand equity research, it's about 100 years old. It's always been a business, but the model has changed over time. So initially, it started essentially as a fairly straightforward consulting business. The client, which would be the fund manager or the broker, and in the early days in the 20s, would pay a fee and receive a service. Fairly straightforward, mostly telephone based. It then became much more sophisticated, DLJ being one of the forerunners, and a couple of other firms really beginning to develop equity research or investment research as you now see it. It was still essentially a fee-based model, but then it moved into the broking model, whereby it was paid for as a proportion of the commissions traded. In the US, this was an incredibly profitable model for the brokerage firms and for the research providers. And then in the 70s, the model changed yet again, where essentially it was funded by the investment banks largely. Still, a few firms did survive with the sort of contract model and the consulting model, but it was dominated by the investment banks. It then was picked up by corporate finance and portrayed as a cost center. And corporate finance used it essentially to support deals. And for the very large caps, obviously, the volume of trading was another revenue generator. So the perception changed, but in reality, it was still always a business and a very profitable business. Unfortunately, it also attracted the attention of the regulators in the late 70s and late 80s, really. We're talking about Elliot Spitzer at this time was the first one in fact, even later than that, 2001, Elliot Spitzer's investigation began to lift the lid on practices that were clearly a distortion in the market. And in the end, it was investors paying the price and corporates. There were a series of investigations, a series of new policies, both in the US, UK, and in Europe, and the model for equity research changed again. And in a way, it's come full circle, because now the most independent research is paid for in advance with cleared funds. And for the smaller mid caps, it is paid for by the corporate. But it is much more transparent, because the corporate now knows what the bill is for investment research and equity research, and often so does the investor. Before, in the previous models, before Spitzer, MiFID II, etc., this was no longer the case. It was extremely opaque. No one knew what they were paying for or how much was being paid to produce the research.
So you touched on the opaqueness of the situation there. Company-sponsored research has seen a significant growth, especially since the launch of MiFID II regulations. Why do you think that's happened?
It's another really good question. It's very interesting. We often refer to it as issuer pays research, but it is, it's more commonly understood as company pays research. I think there are several reasons. One is that the legislation that came out of Europe, MiFID II, and the UK, it was originally designed in the UK. The legislation that came out was really targeted at the behavior of portfolio managers and how they paid for the research, because they were seen essentially as the ultimate budget holder, either via trading commissions or via IPO fees when they bought into an IPO, etc. So the regulation was directed at trying to change the way they pay for research. Essentially, it gave them several choices. The only logical choice for most portfolio managers was to pay out of the P&L. And the large portfolio managers with a global business, they decided they would only have one payment model wherever they were operating. So this meant, for example, in the US, if you were bidding for a mandate to support as a local portfolio manager and you were up against an international portfolio manager, you created a fiduciary problem for the mandate holder. So the mandate holder essentially said, well, you can't be on this because it's not transparent the way you're paying for research, which is out of the top of the funds of the people who are giving you funds to manage. Whereas the other portfolio managers, they're now paying out of the P&L, much more transparent, and it doesn't come out of our funds. So this then forced everyone else to change, even though the MiFID II regulation was not specifically applicable in the US, it's created the same change, driven by the global portfolio managers. Now, small and mid-cap research was always tricky to make pay because the volumes were always lower. The other element of MiFID II, Spitzer, etc., is that essentially corporate finance teams find it very, very difficult now to be able to use research in the way that they used to use it to support a deal. So paying for research in the brokerage or funding it has been extremely difficult. So the model was always marginal and really only justifiable if you could generate fees out of a corporate finance transaction. That's pretty much been stopped, which means that small and mid caps just don't get coverage. You'd be surprised at the size of mid caps that do not have proper coverage.